very much. It's great to be here this morning. So we're going to start things off on this censorship session, having a conversation between the three of us, but pretty soon we'll want to throw it out to the audience as well, so please obviously be thinking of those questions or comments that you have on the back of anything that's said today. We're going to be looking at various areas in censorship, not just in media specifically, but also in the public square as well, where people think that there are issues around censorship and free speech and expression and so on. In fact, just this morning, I saw on the one of the headlines on the Times newspaper was universities ordered to guarantee free speech. I'll just read out the first few paragraphs. Universities must pledge to uphold free speech on campus or face being blacklisted by the new higher education regulator the government will announce today. It will force universities to challenge the culture of so-called safe spaces and to answer for the behaviour of student unions that no platform controversial speakers. Jo Johnson, the university's minister, said any that failed to protect freedom of speech could be fined, suspended or ultimately deregistered by the new Office for Students. So that's an interesting development in the general public sphere, because obviously there's been a lot of news stories around this idea of even seasoned feminists like Germaine Greer being no platform by universities because she says things about transgenderism that a lot of the student body disagree with and so on. So I think these issues affect all kinds of areas, but not least obviously the media, whether it be new media or old media. There are questions around what it's appropriate to print or broadcast and where we draw the line. It's great to have Hussein and Ruth both with me for this conversation. Ruth, you've been around a long time in print media. Do you want to just give a little background for those who might not be familiar with your background and where you kind of connect today, I suppose, with this question of free speech, the free press and so on?
Well, I started out doing a traditional apprenticeship on the Birmingham Post and Mail in journalism. But as a good vicar's daughter, I always had a kind of double vocation. I knew ordination wasn't for me. So it was actually my ambition from quite a young age to be the religious affairs correspondent of the Times. And I was very lucky to manage to achieve that about 30 years ago or so. I can't remember how long ago, a long time ago. And I stayed there at the Times for 27 years. And then I felt that I only had 10 or 15, 20, maybe 20 years of working life left, and I wanted to do something else to make a change. And I was very excited by the openings in digital journalism and the way that the whole online revolution was changing the industry, and I wanted to be on the digital side. And although print was always my first love, I wanted to move into a stronger digital environment. So I left the Times, I accepted redundancy and went and did a digital master's at Goldsmiths. And after that, I was very lucky to be offered a job at Christian Today and became editor. And then I'm remaining at Christian Today as editorial advisor, but I'm just about to start on Monday at a new job at The Tablet as their multimedia editor, which is tremendously exciting. Wow. And of course, working in Christian journalism is quite a change from writing about religion on a secular newspaper. This issue of censorship and freedom of speech appears quite different depending on which side of the fence you're on, or it can appear quite different. But fundamentally, the issues are the same. Everyone believes in freedom of speech, everyone wants freedom of speech to be defended, but obviously it has to be within the law. And earlier out there in the green room, you said, what do we understand by a free press? Well, a free press is one that is free from censorship, but that's in terms of ideological and political matters. So you can't have a free-for-all where a press is free to libel people or to incite religious hatred or to invade privacy. There have to be legal restrictions on freedom of speech. And of course, the Christian community finds itself right at the coalface of this debate at the moment, really right in the middle of the eye of the hurricane or the storm or whatever cliche you want to roll out to describe it. And not just the Christian community, the religious community actually, because of the big debates within the churches, Church of England in particular, but really these are taking place across all religious communities over primarily sexuality, but also equality, are tipping over into the freedom of speech debate. And you have under the European Convention of Human Rights, the Article 9 versus Article 10. You know, that is a constant, that's a battleground at the moment that's being fought time and time again in different cases. So that's a quick summary.
Thank you, really helpful. And Hussein, in a sense, you started where Ruth has ended up. You started in digital with Buzzfeed.
I mean, I was doing a lot of stuff before Buzzfeed, but I came from a generation of journalists that accepted that digital was going to largely be where we were. So when I graduated in 2013, I think that was when we were having lots of conversations about print is dying. There was this documentary about the New York Times that had come out that year with the underlining premise of how will the New York Times make money because its print product is going down the gutter. More peaceful times, maybe. So that was kind of the precedent of which I went to journalism school. When I left the NCTJ, which is the 6-month kind of training vocational course where I trained in print, and I only touched a computer like 6 times during the 4 months there. My first job was actually in tech, so I was a developer, programmer, and then I moved into broadcast for a bit, and then I went over to Buzzfeed. So I sort of always knew that digital was where I was going to be and where we had to like build our profiles, build our voices and stuff like that. Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say, because I think being a multimedia editor is like a very different and actual proper job than being kind of just like a writer who happens to work on digital. But I think the way that we talk about what does it mean to be a digital journalist has changed a lot. So it varies from just writing stuff online to like maybe being a live blogger, to being someone who does data journalism and coding, to someone who makes like visuals, graphics, video, like even games now, like the FT did like in a game a couple of weeks ago about the gig economy. And I think that's really interesting in terms of direction to where it goes. I think in all those contexts, the notion of free speech, the conversations we have around free speech changes a lot. So that ranges from anywhere to do with like libel, like how we fit the nature of free speech into law when it comes to not necessarily doing conventional journalism, but effectively building products, building designs. That has a lot of implications, and I'm sure that we'll talk about this for the rest of the panel.
I mean, you also do work for Vice as well. You're working with Theos as well.
Yeah,
and so
two different.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, when it comes to maybe that edgier stuff, you know, that Vice do and that sort of thing, BuzzFeed, do you find they're a bit more willing to go to the edges of where maybe the traditional press sort of knows where the boundaries are legally, whereas the digital platforms are maybe, it's a bit more grey as to what they...
I'm not sure, and I think part of it is because I've never worked in a traditional media newsroom as a staff person before. And I've been writing for Vice for years, and I've been doing work with them, you know, since I was a graduate. And the reason why lots of people like me went to Vice was because they did stories about youth culture and things that were on like the fringes of society at a time when traditional newspapers weren't doing that. I think that's sort of changed now. That's a lot to do with the fact that even at traditional newspapers, where they've invested a lot into digital newsrooms, they're also investing into young people who have come from similar environments. So you'll find like similar stories. In terms of news, like if you look at the BuzzFeed homepage and you look at the Times homepage, there'll definitely be some similarities. I think the point of differences is how different platforms talk about this stuff, the types of people who write about these things and what environments they come from. I think ultimately, like the idea of like traditional versus new, the lines have kind of blurred a lot. Especially like, you know, there's loads of, you know, people who worked at traditional newspapers who are now working at BuzzFeed as like staff writers. Loads of people who were working at traditional TV stations who now work for the Vice TV channel and so on. There's loads of crossover and even the other way around. You know, so that stuff has kind of blurred a lot. But in terms of like differentiating, I think a lot of it tends to come from perspective. So.
When it comes to the religious side of censorship, I'd be interested in both of you sort of commenting on where you feel the line should be drawn or not be drawn when it comes to possibilities of offending people. I mean, one of the classic cases of the last few years was the Charlie Hebdo and them publishing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad and so on. A lot of people stood up, especially obviously in light of the tragedy when Islamists attacked them, but stood up for their right to publish those kinds of cartoons, even if they don't personally find them the kind of thing they would publish and so on. Do you think, where do you think the line should be drawn on that sort of material, Ruth?
Well, I think it's a very difficult area to make hard and fast rules over, and it's an area that when the government was introducing the race and religious hate law, I know we've got Justin Wolford in the audience, so it would be really helpful to have him maybe clarify anything I don't get quite right here, not being a lawyer myself. But when the religious and race hatred law was going through Parliament, there was an attempt to make, or it was seen as its original form as possibly legislating against religious humour under the guise of outlawing inciting religious hatred. So the law was the draft act was amended to remove that risk after a big campaign by comedians across the country. Nevertheless, inciting religious hatred does remain an offence. So obviously those cartoons, you know, are potentially in both areas. Now, when that story broke, I was on The Times, and The Times, along with many other papers, did not publish those cartoons, and that was the right decision. Now, legally, technically, they probably could have published them without breaking the law. But I remember discussions taking place where we knew that if we published them, people might die. And so we didn't want to be, The Times didn't want to be responsible for something that could lead to people being killed as a result.
Yeah. Well, I know that you've got experience of how religious satire is dealt with actually within predominantly Muslim countries as well. So what's your take on that?
I think on the Hebdo stuff, I'm trying to remember back to that, because I remember those conversations and how difficult those conversations were in terms of, do we publish, do we not publish? Some editors being called cowards for not publishing, but at the same time, your responsibility as an editor to your reporters for their utmost safety, which is also why we're still having conversations about like security in newsrooms, and you know, most established news desks will now have some form of security guard. Just really bizarre to think about, but yeah, that's kind of the state of where we are. I think with the Hebdo thing, with the Charlie Hebdo cartoons and what happened, I still find it really difficult to kind of figure out what my take is on that. Because on the one hand, as a reporter, and as a reporter with friends who have died in the field doing jobs, or doing their jobs and holding truth to power, I believe in the right for the free press and the power of the free press and the importance of holding power accountable in whatever circumstance. On the other hand, I think the conversation we had during the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, and this was largely about Charlie Hebdo itself, lots of it became conflated. So it started off as this conversation of people who draw cartoons or write satire or do news, deserve to do so without impunity in any circumstance and without, any form of, punishment from powers. On the other hand, I think there was this sort of ignorance over what those cartoons, they weren't just religious satire. Lots of those cartoons had like racial undertones. They had, it wasn't just like a critique on theology. And I think maybe this is kind of where our conversation is. Because it's so, the fact that it is so blurred is that even people who think about this find it difficult to kind of separate its different components. So when we talk, I think if we were talking just about, race, should we be publishing stuff that, diminishes people because of, their racial identities? It would be a very different conversation than religious identities. And I think, maybe part of that is, a more secularized state, and also a really important thing, a very, very secularized media landscape, one where very, very few people are religious. I'm just, as my last point, I think there was a Reuters study. It was from the Oxford Media Centre, which showed that like less than 5% of journalists who work in newsrooms would identify as religious. And I think that kind of says a lot about the way that we talk about religion, the way that we report about religion, and also the way that we talk about like global politics when religion kind of goes into that.
Evidently, there's a certain amount of self-censorship then that's going on as to whether this, rather than it necessarily being a legal issue, whether these things are the right thing to do for a particular media organisation. What I do often see when these types of issues come into the press and on my social media feed is a lot of Christians getting annoyed because they feel like there's a double standard here and that Christianity is fair game. Anyone can say what they like and parody and ridicule it, but not with Islam is often the narrative that's being done. Now, do you agree with that at any level, Ruth, or do you think actually, no, there are lines where Christians equally, their feelings are being taken into account when it comes to what the media do or say about Christianity?
Well, I think to go back to the legal side, free speech does include the right to shock, disgust and offend, and that means it includes the right to offend people, religious people as well as anybody. But in the European Convention, there's a massive list of restrictions on that right, and one of those rights is one of those restrictions is it mustn't provoke disorder. Protection of health and morals is another restricting factor, and then there are national security concerns. Now, it is a fact that if you offend Christians, you might be at less risk of provoking public disorder than if you offend some other people. And so that has to be taken into account. So it's not so much self-censorship, although it is self-censorship in line with what journalists know to be the law. Now, I would say to Christians, they should be proud of the fact that they can be offended, and proud of the fact that theirs is a faith that is strong enough to withstand offence, and should almost court it, in a way, or not court it, but as I say, be proud of it, and welcome the fact that their faith is strong enough to cope with that, and this is it's part of being effective in a human society to be able to cope with that. And if I was a member of a religion that couldn't cope with that, I would want that religion to become robust enough to be able to cope with ridicule and criticism without resorting to extreme methods to confront it, as we saw in the Hebdo.
Did you want to comment on that, Hussein?
I think it's a good point. I didn't really think about it in that way. I think, obviously, I come from a Muslim background. I come from a Muslim family. And that's not to say that humor doesn't exist, I would say that I've been thinking about this ever since Casey talked to me about this last week. The differences in terms of religious humor, because obviously with my job at Theos, we deal a lot with Christians who are at times very rightfully angered by the fact that their religion is kind of mocked in mainstream culture and mainstream mainstream media in ways that other religions aren't, and they do see that as a double standard. I think in some contexts they're completely right. I think in other contexts, lots of people who, and they're not even necessarily Christians, but they're people who just feel that Islam gets away with a lot of stuff. And they in my opinion, they sort of ignore a couple of things. They ignore the fact that there is certainly a lot of Muslim-themed humor that happens within Muslim communities. There aren't really a lot of Muslim comedians, but if you every so often they pop up on BBC One, and they'll often make jokes, largely about Muslim culture. It won't necessarily be about theology, and I think a lot of the time that's because the theology is quite difficult to grasp if you're not from a culture that really understands that. It's really difficult to make jokes about, particular lines in hadiths if you don't really know what they are. So a lot of the time those jokes will largely be about Muslim culture, and they'll be to do with things like marriage or, food or, mums. Mums is a really big part of Muslim humor. I spend too much time on Twitter, and there's a lot of dark humor in corners of Muslim Twitter. I can sometimes be part of that, but the thing is, it won't necessarily make, it won't necessarily, make the mainstream. It won't really be seen in terms of mainstream television.
A lot of people might get the impression from those stories that tend to circulate that Muslims have no sense of humour and cannot take a joke, whereas in fact within the Muslim community there is a certain amount of actually. There is a humour that we certainly do share.
And the thing is that will develop. We kind of, forget that this is, the first and second generations of British Muslims are still growing up. And haven't been until very recently that those Muslims have, been open to taking jobs in media and entertainment and stuff like that. There's a wave of Muslim comedians right now, not just in the UK, but actually largely in the US, who are doing things that were, completely inconceivable a few decades ago. There's this film called The Big Thicke by an American comedian called Kumail Nanjiani, who comes from a Muslim country. And if you watch the film, there are lots of jokes that he makes about Muslim and Pakistani culture that, wouldn't have, they would have caused a lot of offense. And in some circumstances, in some aspects, they have. There's lots of essays. There's a fair amount of essays online criticizing him for making these redundant comments about Islam and Muslims. But the fact that it exists and the fact that it's found a place in mainstream culture shows that it's sort of changing. So I think when we kind of have those conversations about why isn't Muslim humor as advanced and as open as say Father, why is there no Muslim Father Ted? Maybe there will be in a few decades.
Before we throw it open to the audience, again, Ruth, coming back to that place we started in terms of this Times headline about universities ordered to guarantee free speech. There's been that story last week about Balliol College, Oxford University, in fact, my old college, where the Christian Union weren't allowed initially to advertise at a freshers' fair because the JCR student president then felt it might be damaging to the welcome of freshers and so on. And then just yesterday was another story doing the rounds about a school's charity that has been banned at a Church of England school from presenting assemblies because the parents didn't like the theology that they apparently were passing on in the assemblies to the children and so on. So there's a lot of these stories where in the public sphere, some people are saying Christianity is being censored at some level. Quite apart from how it's treated in the media, there's a sense in which it's harder to be a Christian and have that voice heard in a culture which might not like some of the things that some Christians say about certain issues. So any comments on that?
First of all, I'd just like to say that I saw The Big Thicke, and it's one of the best films out there. It's really amazing, and if you haven't seen it, really, I strongly recommend going to see it. It's about a Muslim who's trying to have a career as a stand-up comedian and the various disasters that befall him that are extremely, extremely funny. And it's really brilliant. So, yes, well, this is the Article 9 versus Article 10 Venn diagram that people in the Christian world, in our Christian world, are encountering the whole time. So we have Article 10, which guarantees freedom of expression, but Article 10 guarantees freedom of religion as well as thought and conscience. So in this school in Kent, I believe, the story you mentioned, the charity has been told they can't take assemblies, so they can continue to hold after-school clubs and so forth.
Which is on a voluntary basis.
On a voluntary basis, yes. So one of the stories that I read, a child or some children were going home and their parents were reporting the children were confused. And apparently, I'm only going on what I read in The Guardian and a couple of other places, the children were told, at one point, or a child was told that men can't marry men. Well, clearly in law, men can marry men. And so this was confusing for the children. And that seems to be one of the areas. So this is very interesting in terms of Articles 9 and 10, because, of course, at the moment it's very important, especially to the conservative evangelical community, that the church and the churches or their Christian leaders take a strong stand on what they regard as the biblical orthodox view of marriage, and that marriage is only between a man and a woman. So therefore, people would see it as their gospel-driven imperative to teach this to children. But of course, this is in direct conflict with the secular law. And so there is a limit. So there you get this clash between the right to express your religion freely, and then what the secular law determines. And it's a shame that children get caught up in that battle. What my comment would be on that, and that this is a difficult area that the churches are still working out. And of course, when Justin Welby was asked by Alistair Campbell about this issue that Tim Farron also got caught up on, Justin Welby said, "I'm unable to give a straight answer to the..."
Slightly unfortunate choice of words.
And that we all know what happened to Tim Farron. And I just don't understand why the churches are not saying to people in positions of leadership, why these trusts are not saying to children, maybe they are, I don't know, but why people are not saying, let God be the judge. And really, I plead the Pope always on this issue. And I just don't understand why this exemplary authority that we have in the form of this fantastically likeable and accessible Pope, who has not changed even the tiniest bit of church doctrine, but has found a way to address this issue that keeps him and his church out of trouble. Why is the other evangelical community here not adopting this approach and let God be the judge?
Again, coming back to not necessarily the specifics of the issues of sexuality, but generally, do you have any sense that Christians are having a harder time in terms of their views, in any sense, being censored in the public sphere as well as in...
So I didn't know a lot about the Christian group. I have sort of been looking at the Balliol incident a bit, and obviously this Times headline today has interested me for lots of different reasons. So we can go on to that. So, you know what, when I heard the Balliol thing, it was sort of like, it made me realize that nothing's really changed since I left university. I think there's this kind of, there's this thing where it's like, in recent years, universities have become increasingly less tolerant, or students have become increasingly less tolerant of groups that they don't agree with, that don't fit into whatever you want to call. I'm trying to remember what one of these right-wing bots told me the other day. It was Marxist-Leninist.
Did they use the word snowflake at some point?
No, but I imagine they would. It was Marxist-Leninist, Marcuse. I don't know what it was. And it was just no, nothing. These types of groups that have been very skeptical about religion. And correct me, in terms of the Balliol thing, did it turn out that actually it wasn't just the Christian Union that was barred from holding a stand, but they wanted to do one stand, which had
in
all
the end,
religious...
they allowed, the Christian Union was allowed to exhibit as part of a multi-faith stand. And in the end, in fact, the student union at Balliol actually had a vote saying this must never be allowed to happen again, and making sure that religious groups have the right to... So I think that it was more the actions of an individual which were then overturned, and so in a sense, I think...
So there's some firebrands with a certain degree of power. I haven't been to an Oxford college, so I don't know how it works, but I know that in the university that I went to, we always had these characters who just wanted to make headlines, or they wanted to make some sort of change. They wanted to even if it just annoyed people. There were people in my student union who just did stuff because they wanted to annoy people. So they used to kind of put out things in newspapers that were we're going to ban the rowing team. And to kind of see that really just, to kind of see newspapers really freak out about that stuff. And for it to kind of, there's this thing where there'll be some event, it'll end up in the front page of the Times, get more space than it does initially. Sky News will spend the whole morning doing that big debate with the big heads, and And it will just be like this really bizarre, story that kind of went way out of proportion. And I think that's sort of similar.
My feeling on that story was when I was there, getting on for 15 years ago or whatever, I could imagine that situation potentially could have happened, but it would have just been dealt with. Whereas today, I think there's a lot more of a sense of, I'm going to tweet this, put this on my social media, get it out there, because everyone wants to talk about their particular injustice that they feel
and you've got loads of news reporters whose jobs are now like just scan Twitter and see what's happening. So it's like we've got this perfect digital news economy where you can get easy and cheap news by looking for outrage, and like the best forms of outrage happen in places where lots of young people are. Lots of like trans issues recently have kind of been revolved around that, like hearsay and rumors and like things that aren't really 100% true, and then we find out the next day or like a few days afterwards that so maybe some of this happened, but actually the story was much more nuanced, by which point the agenda completely changes. So we're sort of
to the nuanced version.
So we're sort of like, and I think just to kind of quickly touch on like the Times front page of today, I think that's like a good example of like where this can lead us to, because what it essentially does, this conversation about like free speech on university campuses, I have no idea where it's come from, and then the only place that I can imagine seeing it come from is like America, right, where you've got all these stories about like, Black Lives Matter doing like protests at like UC Berkeley and like burning stuff down and everything. And like loads of that turned out to be untrue. Loads of that just turned out to be like, things that were exaggerated. There was like there was a rumor that went around for like 1 or 2 hours during the protests that were happening, which was that like a group of like renegade Black Lives Matter people decided to go like burn down the biology building, and it never turned out to be true. But it got shared thousands and thousands of times, because in a moment like that where you've got very few journalists on the ground, you haven't really got a method of verifying things quickly. And like, I remember when I was working at Buzzfeed and the Paris attacks happened in 2016. While the Paris attacks were happening, there was this rumor that had circulated saying that like this far-right group had gone and burnt down the whole of the refugee village in Calais. It turned out to be untrue. I was on that story for 4.5 hours in the morning trying to verify it, and in the meantime you had like radio stations in the UK, and I won't mention them just in case some of them are in the room, who like were running this story, who were like, this far-right group has entered Calais and they're burning tents. It's like it turned out to be untrue. So, we can talk about this. We can talk about this for ages. But I think even when if we're covering religion, we want to talk about religion, and we know that religious debates are nuanced and that they require much more depth in order to get them right. We should also take that and apply it to other parts of news as well.
We must open it up to the rest of the room. There is a roving mic, so please wait until you get the roving mic to you before you ask your question, and tell us who you are as well. Before we take the first question, I did want to ask Justin Walford, who's head of legal for Sun. Is Justin in the room? I think we were going to start with you, Justin, for some comments, because you obviously have spent a lifetime looking at these sorts of censorship issues.
Thank you. So I'm the head lawyer at The Sun. I've been there 12 years. You can imagine we have lots of these issues coming up all the time. Actually, it's a great privilege. It's a great privilege as a Christian to be there, actually. It's a very professional place. But let's put that to one side. On the issues that you raised, I was in the newsroom when the Charlie Hebdo came up, and there was a lot of discussion about what to do. And just as it was taking place 2 floors below on the Times, we were discussing the same thing, and we made the same decision not to run that cartoon on that occasion. Can I just make a point about, it seems to me just legally, looking at the legal position. If we'd been here 40 years ago when this charity began, and we were talking about censorship, we'd have been talking about censorship in the light of maybe the Festival of Light, talking about Lady Chatterley's lover or the Oz trial or the Romans in Britain trial. But we'd be talking about censorship from a perspective of, we have to remember this, Christians having been involved with censorship. The state censored certain views, and the state, in fact, in those days, only censored views that were anti-Christian. That's the way the blasphemy laws were drafted in those days. So the debate in those days was essentially for Christians, sort of protecting society, protecting morals in society, and it's picked up by Article 10, as you've said, which was actually drafted by English lawyers in the when it was first drafted. But we were essentially protecting God. That's what was happening. What has now happened is that the censorship debate has sort of moved on, because what we're now talking about is really a public order matter. We live in a society, a multiracial society, a society of lots of different views, and we somehow have to all get on together. And whether we like it or not, we find that some people have very, very strong views about some matters. It may be religious beliefs that are very, very close to them that they don't want insulted. Now, how do we, in a society, in a community, balance freedom of speech, the right to criticize, the right to stand up, the right not only to express our views and to disagree, but the right to propagate our views? The right to proclaim that we believe in Jesus Christ, for example, on a street corner. How does that right conflict with other people's rights just to live in safety or not to cause a public order offence? Or how does that conflict with other people's rights not to be offended? And is it a level playing field? If we are Christians and we live in a Christian society, have we got less right to be offended than someone who comes from maybe a minority group, or somebody who is perceived, perhaps has views on being trans or whatever their position is, but they essentially come from a minority, a view where they've had to face persecution in the past? Does that change the playing field? Do we have to take account of that? So when we're talking about universities having, space for people, it seems to me we have to look back and actually say that our generation, we went through universities, that there were lots of issues that we didn't grant people free space about. So we should be blushing about certain issues. We have had prejudice, and we need to recognize that. And as Christians in the Christian church, when we talk about the media and the 5% you were talking about, the reality is that if you go to most newsrooms, and I've worked with over 7 national newspapers, 34 editors over 34 national editors over well over 30 years. The reality is that we've become relevant only in certain areas. Newsrooms think of, they used to think of Christians as relevant, I don't know, on the death penalty. You rang someone up and you found some nutty Christian who told you that we should bring back the death penalty straight away. Or it's now about homosexuality. Or it's going to be about, equality. We've just got ourselves into a corner where the only issues that the media are interested in are those issues. And we need to show that actually there's a vast amount of work being done by Christians in whole different areas. And we need that to get across to newsrooms. It's got nothing to do with those areas. But back to the censorship point, it seems to me we need to recognise now we're really talking about a public order matter rather than a moral matter. How do we live together in society, and what compromises do we have to make on free speech if we are all actually to be able to live at peace?
Thank you. It sort of reminds me a bit of what David Gassi was saying about God doesn't really need to be defended at one level by our blasphemy laws. But any other comments or questions to the panel? I think there's one right just at the back there. To tell us who you are first, thanks.
I'm Pete Wooding. I'm a freelance journalist, and I was involved a few years ago doing some filming for the Christian Institute, and they partnered with some unlikely people to campaign for the reforming Section 5 for free speech. So they worked with Peter Tatchell, Rowan Atkinson, comedian, and the Secular Society to get Section 5 reform. What do you think of working with people that you don't agree with some things on to campaign for free speech?
They were unlikely bedfellows, as you say, the Christian Institute and the Secular Society. But any thoughts on that, Ruth or
Yeah, I've
Hussein?
got so who do you think said this about the Asher's Bakery gay cake debate? You're familiar with that story, yeah. This verdict is a defeat for freedom of expression, as well as meaning that Ashers can be legally forced to aid the promotion of same-sex marriage against their wishes. It implies that gay bakers could be forced by law to decorate cakes with homophobic slogans. It seems the judges have decided that business cannot lawfully refuse a customer's request to propagate a message, even if it's sexist, xenophobic or anti-gay, and even if the business owners have a conscientious objection to it. So any guesses who said that? Exactly. So that's what I think about. I think working with Peter Tatchell can be a great benefit, because sometimes your biggest opponents can be your greatest assets.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I've had Peter Tatchell on my radio show a couple of times, and I've a great deal of respect for him because he genuinely does believe in free speech ahead of his personal, areas where he wants to see those kind of rights and equalities. And so it's been interesting to see him and other people at odds sometimes with where you'd expect them to be in terms of these kinds of conversations. I suppose that's one area where you do see unlikely people working together. I don't know if anyone can think of any others off the top of their head where you see that. Brexit, yeah. Right. Well, give us the
Labour,
specific example.
The Labour. What was it? It wasn't Leave.eu. Was it one of the unofficial Leave campaigns? We had like Kate Hoey and Michael Gove and stuff. Yeah. I think that might be the only time when like odd bedfellows.
Well, I thought the same when I saw Giles Fraser and Widdicombe working together, as Christians for Brexit and so on.
Adrian Hilton, yeah. Giles Fraser and Archbishop Cranmer. Who would have ever put them in bed together?
Indeed. So, any other questions and comments from the floor? There's one over on the left-hand side.
Hi, Mark Warburton. I'm a TV producer. Do you think that some censorship is actually almost passive, and because there is a kind of a risk-averse nature from younger people who are also maybe lacking in some religious literacy, so that when a story runs, they think to themselves, "Oh, this features Christians. It might be controversial, so I won't go there." Because they maybe haven't got time to properly research it, or a kind of an example from that in a different way was a few years ago I was filming outside a department store on a street, and it was in a public place, and one of the members of the staff from the department store came out and said, "Oh, what are you filming?" And I said, "Oh, we're filming for a Christian television program." They said, "Oh, great, I'll just tell management." And management came and said, "Oh, great, it sounds brilliant, I'll just ring head office." And then a few phone calls later, ashen faces, "I'm very sorry, we can't be seen to be associated with anything religious, so we must ask you not to film here." So I just wonder if there's a religious literacy thing going on, which means that some people don't broadcast things just because they fear getting it wrong.
Do you want to respond to those?
I think there's like several things that were on that, and that's super interesting because a similar thing happened to me actually when I was working for an Islamic TV station, and we were filming outside a petrol station. Lots of suspicion of that. I think you mentioned the first thing about young people and risk-averse young. I think actually the opposite might be true. I think young people who like watch TV today are actually like really open to stuff that's like risky and stuff that is controversial. I'm trying to think, there was a really good example which I've literally forgotten about, but another one was a BBC Three documentary. So BBC Three are now doing lots of these online documentaries, which are made by young people and designed for young people. And one thing that caused some controversy was a documentary called Should I Marry My Cousin? And it was about a young Asian woman who was basically looking into cousin marriage and how prominent is it in the UK, and like what are the challenges that a young person who wants to get married has to face when they have to make this decision. And it was all made by like people who in their like 20s and 30s, and the young woman I think who fronted the program must have only been 20, 21 years old. And the outrage that I saw about that program came from like The Telegraph, it came from The Spectator, it came from right-wing pundits on Twitter who were like dads. People who were like, "Oh, why is the BBC spending our tax money doing promoting Sharia law and stuff like that?" It wasn't young people who were freaking out about it. It was the people who tend to criticize the media for not promoting free speech. So I would not discount young people. I would also say that if you look at like the things that are really popular on streaming services like Hulu and Netflix and stuff, like the things that tend to be really popular are like stuff like Black Mirror. I think there's this thing called Ozark. I don't really watch a lot of Netflix these days, but this is just stuff my cousin tells me. He's like 16, so he's like super trendy and like knows everything. So I wouldn't discount young people. I would say that the problem that you've highlighted in terms of the department store is a really important one, and that actually goes more into like, corporations being more risk averse because, basically for commercial reasons. But then at the same time, corporations, aren't in the business of free speech, and they've never, like for the most part, beyond kind of, very general signaling, they've never really, made any strong judgments on that. And we should bear that in mind when, especially as like the corporatization of media increases, right? At the end of the day, yes, they might be able to help us, they might be able to help make our films and documentaries and everything, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will see eye to eye with us when it comes to free speech, especially stuff that could, in their opinion, hurt their business.
Hi, I'm Helen from Media Watch. I just wondered what you thought could be the opportunities for Christians and people of faith in this current climate, and whether we have to see it as something negative or whether there's something ultimately opportunities for people of faith.
So even though some people are casting it as this is a difficult time to be a Christian because you can't speak so openly perhaps about your faith or whatever, what are the opportunities? What's the glass half full rather than empty? Any thoughts on that, Ruth?
Well, last week I delivered the Ebor lecture in York, and it was about the online revolution and how I believe, along with a number of other people like Niall Ferguson, that we're going through a new reformation that cuts across society, but of course the religious world is intimately affected by that now, just as it was 500 years ago in the Reformation and 500 years before that with the Great Schism. And in order to add something new to this lecture, I commissioned a piece of research from Comres, from Katie Harrison. And this research, we asked people who they would turn to. It gave them a list of the 6 options when making a difficult decision or in a crisis. And the options included Google search, Facebook, friends and family, priest, prayer, don't know kind of thing. And I was very surprised by the results. So far fewer people turned to the internet than I had expected they would. That people's main place they turned to was friends and family. Then second was Google search. But it was 71% to 50%. There's also, and then experts were quite high up there as well. So there was a sex difference. So women tended to prefer friends and family, whereas men tended to go to experts. That was quite a marked difference between the sexes. But when you got further down, as regards the lower choices, so people could only choose 2 things. So even the lower choices were quite significant in this survey. They chose prayer over Facebook and Twitter. So we weren't asking about where they would go for entertainment or for socialization. We were asking about serious decisions. And people would still pray rather than turn to Facebook. And I think that's really interesting. And that represents a real opportunity for the churches. It's a problem and an opportunity. The problem is obviously why aren't more people turning to prayer? And even when I was writing this lecture, it didn't occur to me to go to my local vicar. And no one going to the local vicar was obviously a very low priority for people in terms of a crisis. So if the churches want people to turn to them, they need to become their friends. So the vicar or the church leader becomes one of the friends that people turn to, because that was right at the top. But also people still pray, and that can be something that the churches can learn to develop. With the massive use of social media for all kinds of things, across everything. Promoting prayer, using the prayer apps. Well, the With It churches are already doing this. The Church of England seems now to have more. I think the latest attendance figures published just a few days ago showed that their outreach on social media is now greater than their actual physical attendance in churches. A bit like, newspaper readership, the church is going the same way. Everything is virtual or even augmented reality. Are the churches getting into augmented reality in any kind of serious, creative way? Not just the churches, all the religions. So there are still fantastic opportunities, and our environment of freedom of speech promote or enhances those opportunities. And all that's required is a little bit of imagination and creativity to use them wisely, which is what I'm hoping to do when I start at the tablet next week.
One of the opportunities I would say is an obvious one, is that the fact that people are having these debates in the media about what Christians shouldn't believe or what they should and shouldn't say in public is an opportunity for Christians to be sensible and rational, and hopefully they might not have had that opportunity to even talk about their faith. My worry is obviously the media tends to like the polarized views, and so you get people on opposite ends of the spectrum. I think it's how Christians who maybe occupy some kind of sensible middle ground can put their voice across as well into those kinds of debates, and actually say you don't have to be a kind of flag-waving, anti-gay Westboro Baptist person to have a sensible view on these kinds of issues, sort of thing.
And I'm just thinking, I think like Ruth's completely right in that it's actually a really interesting and unique time for organizations to be doing lots of stuff in-house by making their own stuff. Because at the end of the day, I think it is really difficult. And I think as a press person at Theos, it's really difficult to book our researchers onto programs, because when they do, when the producer calls you to do the screening, and you have a really nice chat with them, and then it's like, oh, we're going to go with a firebrand instead because it'll make really good TV. And that happened to us a lot. Because we're a very academic organization, we're an organization that does lots of in-depth research. We don't really have scorching takes on stuff. So a conclusion that we came up with was well, we've just got to start making our own content. And if we value the conversation, if we value dialogue, and we understand differences, but we don't think the differences should be, it shouldn't be portrayed like, an MMA octagon, but it should be, we should explore them, and we should kind of not even find a middle ground, but just find areas that interest us and make us better as people. So we're currently working on some new podcast projects. We're planning to move into video next year, doing lots of kind of stuff in-house, not only for the audience that we have, but to actually reach out to an audience that really wants this stuff. Because our internal research showed that we had an audience that felt that religion wasn't being portrayed well on the normal channels that they reached, and there wasn't really a lot of entertainment on streaming services that kind of really reflected a type of Christianity that was robust, intellectual, but also kind of spoke to the spiritual side of the types of people who fund our work. Just the last point on people of faith, it's also a very interesting time because I think the zeitgeist online is one that really kind of reaches towards identity, and the idea that religion isn't just. I think if you come from a secular environment and you're working on religious TV shows, it's very easy to kind of see religion as just being theological, and the idea that if we're making religious content for public consumption, that it has to be, theology first. And I think what online nature shows us is that it's actually much more about identity, and the barriers to entry when you look at it from a point of view of identity are much lower. Because you don't have to, we want to make accessible TV, so we want to make accessible media content. And I think that, people of faith generally are starting to notice that. So in Muslim communities, they're doing kind of comedy shows, drama shows, which don't necessarily kind of hit on the theological side of Islam, but they kind of say, as a Muslim person, this is how I feel in Britain. Lots of stuff on, if you look at the obscure Jewish internet, there's lots of interesting podcasts, comedy podcasts around, well, what does it mean to be a Jew in Britain? And that stuff really proliferated, with the rise of Jeremy Corbyn and this conversation that we're having about anti-Semitism. So maybe I think if we saw Christianity in that way, or we kind of approached making media content through the lens of identity rather than necessarily theology, we might not only be able to make some really cool stuff, but we may actually be able to have some more accessible conversations as well.
Can we have a round of applause for Ruth and Hussein?